Did you know that in 1978, when I was 2 years old, weather warfare was banned at what was called ENMOD, the Environmental Modification Convention, or the long version at the bottom of the screen there. Basically, this was, a UN sanctioned meeting banning weather warfare. How is that possible? I was 2 years old when this happened. And, I've never even heard of weather modification till I was like 35. You know what I mean? So this is a shocker to me. So I really dug into the history of weather modification. And it turns out there is a very lengthy history, which you'll be able to see in a timeline format on weathermodificationhistory.com. So this is Charles Mallory Hadfield, 1915, the moisture accelerator. And this guy, he would burn chemicals in evaporating tanks that he claimed would make rain. Well, the city of San Diego actually signed a contract, made a deal with him. They said, we'll pay you $10,000 if you can make it rain and fill our dam up. Well, he did it. And in fact, he flooded the Lake Morena Reservoir, and the dam failed, and it cost $3.5 million in flood damage. So at the end of the day, San Diego said, we'll pay you the contract, but you got to assume responsibility for all the damage you did. So at the end of the day, San Diego and everybody agreed that God did that. Hadfield didn't do it. Hadfield ran out of town. He was never paid. There's a great Widespread Panic song about it called Hadfield. Widespread Panic, highly suggest them, love them. So moving along, the birth of cloud seeding. Now this is when we transitioned from what was called the pluviculture period, or the rain-making period, where all manner of cannons and, like you saw with Hadfield, chemicals, just every manner of crazy was attempted to make rain. But then science just reared its ugly head, and Vincent Schaefer breathed into this freezer, and Langmuir and Vonnegut were like, yeah, we told you so, and cloud seeding was born. And these three guys were hanging out at General Electric, and they're scientists, and less than a year later, General Electric scientists in concert with the U.S. Navy. I've actually got some new intel on this telling me that the Weather Bureau had nothing to do with this. More info to come on climatebureau.com. You always got to love that. The minute you say something, somebody goes, hey, but wait. So long story short on this was a tropical storm. It wasn't a hurricane yet, but the minute that they seeded this tropical storm, the Cape Sable hurricane was formed. It abruptly changed color and direction, 120-degree turn, and slammed into Savannah, Georgia, killing one person and $3.2 million in damages. Whoa. So in less than a year, they invented cloud seeding. Less than a year later, they screwed with a hurricane, a tropical storm that turned into a dark-colored hurricane that killed a guy. You just can't make this stuff up. Of course, there's a lot of conjecture about it. They say that there were actually atmospheric wind troughs, and this was all natural. It would have turned anyway. But, I tend to ascribe to the if you break it, you buy it. So then in 1949, Irving P. Crick, little-known guy, he actually invented the ground-based cloud seeder. To this day, most people don't even know about these things. But ground-based cloud seeding actually supersedes aerial cloud seeding by far. They do way more ground-based than they do aerial. So this is a very influential man. The Eyes in Outer Space Disney film that everybody's seen, where they've got the Disney film about steering hurricanes with rockets and satellites. He was the technical advisor on that film, and that's how I found out who he was. I was like, who came up with this idea? Who told Disney that this was a good idea? And I saw Irving Crick. And then I went and I Googled the dude, and I was like, holy crap, this guy's amazing. It turns out that he is credited with inventing all this stuff. Well, guess what? His son is my friend on Facebook now. And he said, you know what? You're the only person on the internet that's ever mentioned my daddy. That's what good research is about, baby. So here, cloud seeding projects, 1952 to 65. You can see that right here, this little curly Q, those are ground-based stations. And you can see that those are along the mountains over here on the West Coast, and X is air-based burning of flares. And you can see they were trying all of them on the East Coast at this time, which is interesting. They tried it all over the East Coast initially, and later that all goes away. Very interesting point. So here's an interesting one as well. In 1958, artificial clouds were blocking the sunlight. Now, see, we're gonna go ahead and early dip into chemtrails. So people talk about chemtrails on the internet and about planes making clouds that are blocking out sunlight. And the debunkers will say, well, planes have always made contrails. They just, they'd melt away. But in this situation, we have, all the way back in 1958, darn Skyriders, Jet Trails, Dim Sun, Palm Springs, Gripes. And he says that the sky's been looking like an exuberant mob of Skyriders who block out the sun. And the Air Force so far is flabbergasted. So it's fascinating. So, aviation had barely been in the air for 10 years, and they were already blocking out the sun in Palm Springs, Florida. More on that to come. We're going to see how history repeats itself. So then, same year, the Navy creates and breaks up clouds with carbon black dust. Now, they did this two ways. They actually made a cloud that was a mile long by pouring carbon black dust into a liquid and then spraying that from the back of a plane. Then they came back and they made puffy clouds and little dots. Then they came back with dry carbon black and melted those clouds away. Carbon black is similar to soot, but it is different slightly. It's a spherical, tiny nanoparticle. It's what comes out of the back of, your car engine. It comes out of the back of jet aircraft. It is the number one cloud seeding. It is the number one seed that creates clouds in the troposphere, the lower atmosphere, where commercial aviation's flying. So cloud seeding with carbon black dust. Fascinating. Preventing forest fires with cloud seeding with Project Skyfire. The entire thing has moved to the nationwide. You've got contractors, experimental pilot projects, and the Bureau of Reclamation. So these are government-funded. Project Skywater. I've got a great video on that on my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/Jim Lee Climate Viewer, and the video is called Mountain Skywater. So check that out. Pretty interesting stuff. And in that, you can hear a dude slapping on a banjo and them burning their ground-based cloud seeders in some awesome video. So now we're going to go a little outside the box. In 1961, the military tried to create an artificial ionosphere by dumping 480 million copper dipole antennas into orbit. Some are still up there, and as far as last count, 36 clumps of these little mini antennas are still up in space. The rest of them, most of them should have burned up on the way down, but some of them are still up in the North Pole in the ice. Military hates the ionosphere. You'll see that over the course of this. Project Storm Fury, NOAA going out steering hurricanes. After Project Storm Fury, which lasted 11 years. After that, they said they would never do it again. We're never going to steer hurricanes again. It was a bad idea. Go read up on it. Plenty of information out there. We're going to cover so much. I'm not going to dig deep into any of this stuff. That's what climateviewer.com is for. If you really want to get your nose wet, come on down. I've got a face full. Plasma seeding begins in 1963. So real quick history lesson in 30 seconds. So they started blowing up the ionosphere. After the needles didn't work, they couldn't create an artificial ionosphere. They wanted to just destroy the ionosphere. So they started doing these upper atmospheric nuclear explosions like Starfish Prime, and the Russians did Project K. And they were literally trying to blow the ionosphere away. There was a thing called the Limited Test Ban Treaty, and it banned upper atmospheric nuclear explosions from that point forward because these people were out of hand. So since they couldn't blow up the ionosphere, since the needles didn't work, they said, well, we still got to find some way to screw with this ionosphere. And thus, plasma seeding was born. And this was creating artificial ion clouds in the interplanetary space for studying the state of interplanetary medium with sounding rocket experiments. So they started dumping barium, aluminum, strontium in space because the ionosphere is invisible. And in order to see it, they would dump these clouds like this, into the the ionosphere, and then they would heat them with microwaves from the ground to see the effects. And in this case, you can actually see those are photos of the effect of making these ion clouds in space. So shocker, for all the people out there who talk about barium and strontium, yes, they've been dumping it in space for 60 years. And in this case, this is 64. So far, 7 different experiments have been carried out in Sahara and Sardinia. So this is 1 year after they banned upper atmospheric explosions. They've already done 7 experiments, and it just escalates from there. Solar power satellite, 1968. This bad boy is a beam of doom. And basically up here, the thing says 2 by 5,000 megawatts output. It is 25 kilometers long. It is in space. It collects solar energy and then beams it down to the ground to a rectenna, be similar to HAARP. More on that later. And the problem is, if that beam gets off of this antenna, it could look like this fire from heaven scenario here. So it was never done because, as in this chart you can see here, rectenna heat would cause weather modification because variation in the refractive index and the beam wandering, the beam scattering, and ground heating and soil moisture evaporation, which would cause more weather modification, which is climate modification. We shouldn't do this. It's going to modify the weather. So the solar power satellite, quote, as long as the program was called Solar Energy by the United States, it could not be considered a weapons project. Hint, hint, Japan just launched a solar powered satellite, and a whole bunch of other people are now revisiting history. They're launching solar power satellites. Remember, that's a weapon system. All right. So why did I talk about planes blocking out the sun in 58? Because by 1970, the airline industry got sued for blocking out the sun in 2 states. At the time, in 1970, chemtrails were called smoke pollution of the sky. And it's right there in the newspaper articles. I've read the congressional testimony of this, the meetings that were done. This is as real gets. Lawsuit by Illinois and New Jersey versus the airline industry. It was settled out of court by Secretary of Transportation Volpe, and the airline industry agreed that they would install burner cans on all of the 43 carriers' planes to reduce particulate emissions, aka soot and carbon black, which we know makes clouds. They had to reduce their soot output by 70%. History is now repeating itself. So 58 to 70, chemtrails, solution, cleaned up their act. Chemtrails went away for a long time. More on that later. So now we're at a point where 30 years after cloud seeding was invented, it is used as a weapon of war.